Well, it's blood, Roger. You can't just let it sit. You have to clean it right away. Well, the staff can't clean it if it's the staff's blood, right? I mean, if you keep killing the staff, we won't have any staff to clean the blood. I mean, it doesn't seem that... Hello, my friends. Hello. And welcome, once again, to stately Vaughn Manor. It's very stately around here. Where Roger and I have returned for Roger's Random Book Show. It is Roger's Random Book Show, the thrill-packed program where Roger and I will just wander around the manor, pick up some books at random, and then talk about them. And that's what we did. We picked up some random books, and now we're going to talk about them. But the first book is not random, because this is a book I got in the mail. I came home from the Rustic Vaughn Lodge, found some unpleasant surprises, and one pleasant surprise. And the pleasant surprise was a gift from my good friend Lise, who likes to send me things now and again. And she sent me this book. This is Horror Stories, Classic Tales from Hoffman to Hodgson. This is an Oxford World's Classics, edited by Darryl Jones. And she sent me this because it's Horror Mayhem, the fantastic reading event created by the Bookish Bryants in celebration of short horror fiction. And I've been talking about Horror Mayhem lately, talking about what I've been reading, what I'm going to read, and the theme for this year is Decades of Dread. And so Lee sent me this because this has some early decades of horror. And so, yeah, Classic Tales from Hoffman to Hodgson. I'm very happy to get this. Kind of surprised I didn't have it, but I didn't have it. So it's kind of cool to get it. Cool cover there. But it's packed full of really cool stuff. Of course, it starts with Hoffman, E.T.A. Hoffman with The Sandman. But we also have a bunch of other great authors in here. Edgar Allan Poe, of course. And the Edgar Allan Poe story in here is Berenice, a Tale, which is, in my opinion, Edgar Allan Poe's most disturbing story. When I first read that story, that was back when I first started reading Poe. I read that story and I said, man, this Poe guy doesn't mess around, because that is a disturbing story, man. It's really good. So I'm glad they chose that one. That was a good choice. We've also got Sheridan Le Fanu's in here, Nathaniel Hawthorne, Herman Melville, James O'Brien, Charles Dickens. I mean, all kinds of great classic writers. Rudyard Kipling is in here with The Mark of the Beast. That was a good story. Charlotte Perkins Gilman's in here with The Yellow Wallpaper, of course. Bram Stoker, Robert W. Chambers. Arthur Machen is in here with the novel of The White Powder. Richard Marsh, W. Jacobs with The Monkey's Paw. Of course, The Monkey's Paw is in here. M.R. James is in here with Count Magnus. That's a good one. Frances Marion Crawford is in here with For the Blood is the Life, of course. Algernon Blackwood is in here with The Wendigo, which was really good. Usually, if Blackwood is included, it's one of two things. It's either The Wendigo or The Willows. And this one has the Wendigo, which was excellent. And it ends up with William Hope Hodgson with The Derelict. So, some cool old-timey horror. This looks like a really excellent anthology. This is probably going to be the next thing I pick up for Horror Mayhem, just because it looks so good and I like this old-timey horror stuff. Love the classic horror. So yeah, I probably will push everything else aside after the book I'm currently reading is done and just read this because it looks fantastic. I did pick up some other things that would be appropriate for Horror Mayhem, though. And one of the things is a book, or a story, I should say. It's a short book that I haven't read for years and years and years. And that is The Turn of the Screw by Henry James. This is a Penguin Classics edition of The Turn of the Screw, which is a book I read when I was a kid. And so I remember the thing about the story. You know, I remember what the story is about. But I don't remember much about it other than that. I do remember it was hard going because I read this when I was a little kid, you know. And Henry James is probably not the best author for little kids. And so I owe it to myself to read this as a grown-up old person. And so I probably will. I'll try to read this at some point for Horror Mayhem. It certainly is not long. It is not a long book to read. So yeah, Henry James, The Turn of the Screw. I'll probably read that. And yeah, here it is. A couple things that I want to talk about that are also horror related. And our old pal, H.P. Lovecraft, makes a return appearance here in Roger's Random Book Show because this book is kind of cool. This is The Shadow Out of Time by H.P. Lovecraft, which is one of H.P. Lovecraft's Cthulhu mythos, one of his later stories. A science fiction story. It's a science fiction horror story, but more than anything, it is a science fiction story. And it was a major story. And it was published in Astounding Stories. It was serialized in Astounding. And it's excellent, excellent story. Really a great classic science fiction story. And S.T. Joshi edited this volume, and he came out with the corrected, which I have here just off screen, the corrected edition of H.P. Lovecraft stories. And when he first put out his original collected edition, which was for Arkham House, he did the corrected editions for those, but he could not do a corrected edition for The Shadow Out of Time, because at that time when he was doing this back in the 1980s, the manuscript for this was missing. Most of his other manuscripts or typescripts for his major stories were available. So those stories were easy to correct. This one was not. And the problem with this is that when this story was printed in Astounding Stories, it's one of those stories that was heavily edited. Paragraphs were broken up, sentence structure was changed, bits were cut out, that kind of thing. The Shadow Out of Time, heavily edited. Perhaps not quite as bad as At the Mountains of Madness, but still, it was pretty bad. And so, S.T. Joshi, when he was putting together the corrected editions, did the best he could. But finally, the original manuscript was found. It had been in the possession of H.P. Lovecraft's friend Barlow. I think it was R.H. Barlow. Let me just see, because he's an interesting character in his own right. Was it R.H. Barlow? Let me see. R.H. Barlow, it was. So R.H. Barlow had the manuscript, and Barlow had gone to Mexico because I think he was a professor in archaeology, and he was working in Mexico. And when he passed away, he had given the manuscript, or the manuscript somehow got in the hands of one of his friends. And the manuscript remained in the hands of this friend until this friend passed away, and the manuscript was identified for being what it was. And eventually, S.T. Joshi finally got his hands on it and was able to finally correct The Shadow Out of Time. That is a very abbreviated version of events. You could actually get the real course of events in the introduction of this particular book. This was published by Hippocampus Press. And I like it particularly because it is an autographed copy by Joshi. And it's just really, really cool. This is just a really, really cool corrected edition of the story. And this is the first time that the corrected edition of The Shadow Out of Time was printed. Now, if you buy the newer H.P. Lovecraft editions that have the S.T. Joshi corrections, you get this version in those editions. But for a long time, you couldn't get those. You couldn't get that, and that's a big deal because this was a major story in H.P. Lovecraft's fiction. It's a really good story, actually. It's not his most frightening story, but it's an excellent science fiction story, and I highly recommend it. So, The Shadow Out of Time by H.P. Lovecraft. Perfect for horror mayhem, by the way. This other book is perhaps not a book that many people would consider for horror mayhem. Perhaps because it's from an author who isn't generally considered a horror writer. He's kind of hard to pin down. He's more of a fantasy writer if you had to pin him down as anything. But he wrote fantasy, science fiction. Most people think of him as a science fiction writer. And that is the late, great Harlan Ellison. and what I consider his best book, which is Deathbird Stories. If any book that Harlan Ellison ever put together deserved to be in the Penguin Classics line, it's this one. Deathbird Stories is a genuine classic. And it's full of horrifying stories. Stories that at least will make you uncomfortable. And they're powerful. This is packed full of really powerful stories from the very beginning to the end of the collection. And it starts off with A Whimper of Whipped Dogs, I believe. That's the first story. Yeah, The Whimper of Whipped Dogs. And it's just full of really, really great, really dark stories. Pain God, all kinds of really well-written, thought-provoking, disturbing stories. And there's a cumulative power to these stories if you read them all together as a collection. And Deathbird Stories is just excellent. Harlan Ellison was a great writer. He's recently had a collection of his stories. I think it was The Best of Harlan Ellison. Just came out recently, which I was happy to see. Harlan Ellison, he deserves to be considered a classic writer, I think, because he was just great. If anything holds him back, I think it's people's perception of his personality. A lot of people didn't like Harlan Ellison, but his talent was undeniable. And this is just a fantastic book, Deathbird Stories. I could not recommend this higher. And I do believe a lot of these certainly count as horror stories, I think. So yeah, Deathbird Stories, Harlan Ellison. This book is something. So there you go. There's that. So let's go from the disturbing science fiction fantasy to fun, pulpy science fiction fantasy. And I've got a 2-volume collection of a series that I've never read the whole of. I've only read a couple of these in paperbacks. But a few years ago, I got these. These are the Chronicles of the Lensmen by E.E. Doc Smith. And these hardcover editions were published by the Science Fiction Book Club. The Science Fiction Book Club did some really cool omnibus editions from different authors. And this is one of the cooler things I think that they did, the Chronicles of the Lensmen. And this first hardcover edition has the earlier Lensman stories. It has Triplanetary, First Lensman, and Galactic Patrol. Galactic Patrol, I think, was the first one I read. I think I read Galactic Patrol, and I might have read Triplanetary, although it's been a while if I did. But I've never read them in this edition, and I'm not exactly sure why that is. Probably because I've got a gazillion books. And for a long time, until the 500 book challenge happened, I just kept buying more of them. So, you know, books that you think I would have read right away sometimes just languished. Like the Chronicles of the Lensmen, which I really need to get to, and I might get to it this July for Rocket Summer. We'll see. But yeah, the Chronicles of the Lensmen, this is volume 1. And this is volume 2 of Chronicles of the Lensmen by E.E. Doc Smith. This has Gray Lensmen, Second Stage Lensmen, and Children of the Lens. Children of the Lens. And like I said, these are just really nice hardcover editions from the book club. And I don't know how easy they are to get now. Sometimes these book club anthologies end up being kind of scarce. Anthologies or collections. Sometimes they end up being kind of scarce. Sometimes they end up being pricey. I haven't checked. I probably should have checked before I made the video, but I didn't. I haven't checked how much these 2 volumes are going for now, but probably too much. They're probably going for too much, although I could be wrong. Certainly all of those books probably are still available as paperbacks. So, you know, they're books you can get, even though at the moment I don't know whether any of those are in print or not. I'm not exactly sure. But I'm happy to have this set of books. And so, yeah, I was going through some old books thinking and found these and thought, I really should read those. Why haven't I read those? So there are those. So we are at the section of the episode now, Roger, where we have to talk about the two things I always talk about here on Roger's Random Book Show. Roger's Random Book Show. The book club's something else. And one of those things is Robert E. Howard. And I always talk about something Robert E. Howard here on the show. And I'm going to be talking about, real quick, a couple of books. And the reason I'm talking about them is because fairly recently, these have been mentioned. And there's some people that are confused by the contents of these volumes. So the first book is The Book of Robert E. Howard. The Book of Robert E. Howard from Zebra. This was edited by Glenn Lord, the late, great Glenn Lord, who was a big part of keeping Robert E. Howard's fiction alive for a long, long time. This has a fantastic Jeff Jones cover. I like this cover an awful lot. Jeff Jones sometimes did some fantastic covers and sometimes some covers that were just like, what? But this is one of his really good covers, I think. So The Book of Robert E. Howard, and that was followed by the second book of Robert E. Howard with another excellent Jeff Jones cover. And recently fairly recently, I did an episode of the Robert E. Howard Show about the best of Robert E. Howard and what I consider the best of Robert E. Howard. And these books were mentioned, and some people think that these books were best of volumes, and they are very much not that. These books came out in the 1970s. This first one came out in, what year did this book come out? Let me see. This book came out in 1976. And at the time, because of Conan and the Conan comic book and the popularity of sword and sorcery in general, Robert E. Howard became a popular writer. And there was a lot of interest in the 1970s for Robert E. Howard and his writings. But there was a lot of stuff that was not in print. The Del Rey editions did not exist. The Robert E. Howard Foundation did not exist. And so, you know, there were some Robert E. Howard in print. A lot got in print, but a lot didn't, at least at the time that this book was put out, The Book of Robert E. Howard. And one of the reasons Glenn Lord put out this book was to give kind of a sampling of the different things that Robert E. Howard wrote that at the time were not in print. And he talks about that a bit in the introduction. I'll just read you this paragraph here that explains it. The Book of Robert E. Howard is a sampling of Howard's writings within certain limitations. I have not included material from any hardback or paperback collection that is currently available or soon to be available. Nor have I included anything from the books tied up due to the collapse of Lancer Books. Thus, stories about most of Howard's best-known characters like Conan, Bran MacMorn, Solomon Kane, Breckinridge Elkins, and King Kull are not present, although The Curse of the Golden Skull is peripherally part of the Kull series. On the plus side, however, many of the stories herein are previously uncollected in any form, several being available heretofore only in rare old pulps. So this was just a really cool book because it was full of stuff you, at the time at least, was pretty rare. And even now, it could be hard to find some of these stories if you don't have all of those Robert E. Howard Foundation Press books anyway. This starts off with Pigeons from Hell, one of Robert E. Howard's greatest horror stories. By the way, that reminds me, Roger, I should plug an upcoming episode of the Robert E. Howard Show, which I hope is going to be on Friday or Saturday, which is going to be the top 10 horror stories of Robert E. Howard. So that's coming up. But anyway, there's a slight chance Pigeons from Hell will be on that list. It's a slight guaranteed chance. Anyway, this is followed by a poem recompense. The Pit and the Serpent is in here, which is a boxing story. We've got etchings in ivory, which I don't know that I've seen in print anywhere else other than here, although I'm sure it is. We've got the poem Samaria is in here. The Bar by the Side of the Road. Knife, Bullet, and Noose, which is a Western story. Gents on the Lynch is in here. She Devil is in here because I guess the paperback of She Devil hadn't been published yet. The Voice of El Lil. Black Wind Blowing. The Curse of the Golden Skull. Black Talons is in here. So there's some cool stuff in here. But like I said, it was mostly stuff that at the time of the printing of this was just not available. So whatever wasn't available in 1976, could be put in this volume. And this volume was popular. It really sold because of the interest in Robert E. Howard. So they came up with a second book of Robert E. Howard, which was not so limiting in its contents. But it had Sword Woman is in this one, The Striking of the Gong, Words from the Outer Dark, Black Canaan's in here, which was an excellent horror story. Kelly the Conjureman's in here. Two Against Tyre, For the Love of Barbara Allen, Guns of Khartoum, the poem Lines Written in the Realization That I Must Die. Other stuff is in here as well. So together, these are just excellent collections. And these are collections that I keep intending to get back to and reread. And so I probably will reread them sometime this year and then probably do a Robert E. Howard show on the two of them. But I thought I would mention them here. And now it's time, Roger, to get to the comics. Of course, I do, Roger, Epic Comic Book Wednesday, every Wednesday. But, there's some comics that I haven't talked about there and might not talk about there. And one of the characters I'm kind of surprised that I haven't talked about yet is the Phantom. So let's talk about the Phantom, probably because I don't have much from the Phantom. The Phantom is a very popular character, but not so popular here as the Phantom is in Europe. I have a friend in Italy who's way into the Phantom. He's a comic book artist and an illustrator in Italy, and he loves the Phantom and has been reading the Phantom since he was a kid. And he has a bunch of old Phantom comics. They're all in Italian, so I can't read them, but he has a bunch of Phantom comics. And there were some really nice collections of the original comic strip that I don't have except in electronic form. I do have them electronically. But as far as actual physical books, I only have this and this. And what these are the Phantom, the Gold Key Years, Volume 1 and Volume 2. And the Phantom, of course, was a comic strip character. And you could consider the Phantom to be the first costumed superhero. You could. In comics. I mean, he was in a comic strip, but, those are comics. And the Phantom existed in a bunch of different comics published by different publishers. Gold Key got a hold of the Phantom and did some really nice Phantom comic books with some really cool painted covers. I love this character. Like I said, I just don't have much from this character. And it's always kind of been that way when I was younger and collecting comics. I mean, you'd go to the comic shop. It was very rare that you'd find anything of the Phantom. He's had a couple revivals, but to get the cool old Phantom stuff, it could be pretty scarce. So I was happy when these came out. I think this one I had pre-ordered for like 100 years before it was finally published. But they're cool. So the Phantom was created by Lee Falk. And there were Phantom paperbacks. There was a Phantom film. There was probably a serial or two, a movie serial about the Phantom. But these books are really nice. They're really cool. And they reprint the Gold Key Years of the Phantom. They have a really nice introduction talking about this character, the ghost who walks, who lives in the jungle and is actually, this is an immortal character because, this is a costumed identity that is passed down from father to son for, over a course of generations. So that's the first issue, the first Gold Key issue of the Phantom. They had really, really cool painted covers on these. I mean, those are really nice. The stories themselves are also pretty excellent. Now, Gold Key, when I was a kid, had a kind of a bad reputation. They were like the third stringer. There was Marvel, then there was DC, then there was Gold Key and Charlton and all those guys. But these comics are pretty cool. I mean, they're in an interesting Gold Key style, where they have the panels without the borders, which is always kind of interesting. But they're fast-paced, fun stories, which have a very pulp adventure feel, which fits right along with this character. This character was born in the comic strips right around that time that pulp heroes came into being, like the Shadow and Doc Savage and all of them. But the Phantom beat those characters into the comics, and like I said, this could be the first costumed superhero in the comics, and he's great. And these books are tremendous fun, and I highly recommend them. I think there was only the 2 volumes, but I've kind of lost track since I'm not buying stuff right now. Look at that. That is so cool. I mean, some of the covers are great. Some of these stories are really awesome too. They're very often better than you would expect them to be. So yeah, I highly recommend the Phantom. I mean, look at that. Look how cool that cover is. Man, this is good stuff. It's the Phantom. He's cool. He's cool. Look at that. Phantom ring. So yeah, the Phantom. In the Gold Key years. These are really, really nice books. Recommend them highly. For those of you interested in comics, the history of comics, superhero characters, all that stuff. You can't go wrong with the Phantom. So, okay, I have been talking long enough. I will catch you next time.